She kicked my wife's crutches with the heel of her wedge sandal like it was a casual Tuesday, as if striking down a disabled woman in public was just another item on her checklist of power moves. The crutches clattered to the pavement with a sound that will live in my spine forever, sharp, metallic, final. But what came after? The thud of my wife's body hitting the gravel, the harsh rasp of her scraped palms dragging against stone, wasn't even the loudest part. No, the loudest part was the silence. That sudden vacuum of noise, as if the entire HOA picnic had inhaled and then forgot how to breathe. People stood frozen mid-bite, mid-sentence, their mouths agape, their fingers still wrapped around flimsy plastic cups filled with punch. A toddler stopped mid-run, clutching a half-eaten cookie, eyes wide. Someone gasped. Someone dropped a spoon into the chili. Time paused, and Karen, the woman who had just committed an act of public violence, smirked like she'd just won a round of HOA bingo. She muttered something under her breath about fakers draining the community, then turned on her heel, not even checking to see if Hannah was conscious. My wife, my best friend, the quiet, fierce woman who'd just undergone spinal surgery 3 months ago and still couldn't stand more than 10 minutes without help, was now on her knees in front of 50 people. And Karen thought she'd just made a point. What she didn't know, what no one in that suburban square of conformity and clipboard authority knew, was that the woman now pushing herself upright with shaking arms, grit embedded in her palms, was not just another resident. She was a newly appointed district judge. And not just any judge. The one who would be presiding over a civil fraud investigation involving the same HOA Karen ruled like a petty monarch. But in that moment, Hannah said nothing. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply looked up at me with that terrifying calm she wore like armor, and I knew immediately, she wasn't thinking about pain. She was calculating. 3 days. That's how long we'd been here. We bought a modest single-story home on the edge of a man-made pond, just far enough from the bustle of city life that you could pretend the world slowed down at sunset. Hannah had chosen it. After the surgery, she needed space, quiet, a porch where she could read and breathe and heal. It had everything she wanted. Enough yard to grow tomatoes, an ADA-compliant ramp built to code, and a promise of peace. What we didn't realize was that behind the pristine flower beds and matching mailboxes was an HOA with teeth, and at the helm, a woman whose hobby wasn't gardening or book clubs but domination. Karen had introduced herself on day one not with a smile, but with a citation. Our mailbox numbers weren't in the approved script, whatever the hell that meant. She slapped the violation sticker on like a cop issuing a speeding ticket, then walked away before we could speak. The next morning, she knocked on our door to inform Hannah, who answered in her robe and braces, that pity parties didn't excuse dragging crutches across decorative walkways. Hannah gave her a tight smile. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. We should have seen the signs. But when you're new, when you're exhausted, when you're trying so hard not to ruffle feathers, it's easy to write off warning signs as quirks. I convinced Hannah we should go to the community potluck. It's just one afternoon, I said. We'll bring cornbread. Sit quietly. Smile. Be normal. Hannah didn't want to. Said her legs were still weak, that people would stare, that she didn't feel up to putting on the mask of fine. But I begged. Told her we needed to show our faces, meet neighbors, prove we weren't trying to be aloof or difficult. That we wanted to belong. So she agreed. We made the cornbread from scratch. I pushed her in her transport chair, then helped her up on her crutches when she said she wanted to stretch her legs. It was maybe 10 steps to the dessert table. Karen made it 7. She strutted over in a sleeveless blouse, designer shades, and the look of someone who'd memorized every bylaw in the HOA handbook. She scanned Hannah from head to toe like inspecting a rental car. I thought she was going to ask if we needed help. Instead, she muttered, "Should have signed up for the neighborhood theater club with acting like that," then, smiling, hooked her sandal under Hannah's crutch and kicked. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, calculated cruelty. It was theater, all right, but not the kind that earns applause. For a full beat, no one moved. Not even the wind. And then everything exploded. Murmurs, shouts, someone filming. I was on my knees beside Hannah, checking her hands, her knees, the way her breath caught in her throat. She was hurt, but more than that, she was activated. Her eyes weren't wide with fear. They were narrow with purpose. She looked at me and said nothing, but I knew that look. I'd seen it when she took down a corrupt city treasurer, using a single line of deposition. I'd seen it in courtrooms, behind closed doors, at 2 a.m. in the glow of her laptop. Karen didn't break her. Karen woke her up. A neighbor stepped forward with a phone. "I got it," he said. "All of it. She kicked. On camera." Karen turned, face twitching, demanded he delete the footage. He laughed in her face. "Maybe go Google battery assault, sweetheart," he said. "See how that ends." We left soon after. Trey, an older man who lived 2 doors down, helped Hannah home. His hands trembled with anger. "She's been doing this crap for years," he said. People too scared to fight back. Welcome to the kingdom. That night, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open. Legal codes, ADA regulations, county annexation maps, she pulled them up with surgical precision. I made tea. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The war had already started. She wasn't angry. She was awake. The ramp Karen hated? Built with medical-grade material, approved by the same codes Hannah helped revise in city court years ago. The violation on our mailbox? Legally unenforceable. The crutches Karen mocked? Documented under medical necessity. And Karen? Just a petty tyrant with a clipboard, about to discover what happens when you kick the wrong woman's support. The next morning, a flyer was taped to our door, about removing unsightly medical devices from view. Hannah didn't blink. She filed it. Day after, the HOA newsletter ran an editorial about able-bodied contribution and non-disruptive appearances. Hannah printed it, underlined phrases in red. I called it the Karen dossier. Day 3, a violation notice for our ramp. Unapproved structural addition, it read. Hannah laughed. Not a full laugh. Just the kind you give when someone steps into their own trap. That evening, she turned to me and said, "Do you think she'll be surprised when she finds out who I am?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because Karen hadn't just kicked a pair of crutches. She'd kicked open the courtroom doors to her own unraveling. The day after the potluck, Karen doubled down. Not just with silence or passive-aggressive stares from her porch, but with printed flyers stapled to every bulletin board in the neighborhood. Community standards reminder, they read in Comic Sans no less. Beneath the cheerful header were lines that might have seemed generic if you hadn't just witnessed her attempt to cripple a woman already recovering from surgery. Phrases like, residents are reminded to avoid displays of unnecessary medical equipment, and we ask all neighbors to maintain decorum in communal events. The kicker? A stock photo of a wheelchair with a red X over it, like this was some kind of satirical cartoon on ableism. But this wasn't satire. It was a slow escalation of psychological warfare, disguised in HOA language. By mid-morning, someone had tucked one of those flyers into our mailbox. By noon, 2 more were taped to our ramp. Hannah didn't tear them down. She photographed each one, carefully labeling the files with timestamps and geotags. Then she printed copies for a folder she began keeping on the living room shelf, simply labeled Pattern of Hostility. It was the first of many. That same day, a new compliance officer appeared. A teenager wearing a reflective vest that hung past his knees, clipboard in hand, looking like he'd been promised community service hours in exchange for being Karen's errand boy. He walked up our driveway, barely glanced at the ramp, then took a photo and scribbled something down. I opened the door and asked if he needed something. He didn't meet my eye. "Just doing a routine inspection," he muttered, retreating as if afraid my voice might be contagious. 10 minutes later, I saw him walk into Karen's garage, which had been converted into a makeshift HOA office with folding tables and stacks of binders taller than her dog. Hannah watched it all from the window, her face unreadable. She didn't move until the boy left. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting a letter, an official inquiry to the county property records office. "If she's deputizing minors for enforcement without municipal authority, that's impersonation," she said quietly, without looking up. "And if she's storing personal data from inspections in her home without resident consent, that's a privacy violation." I asked if she wanted me to help. She shook her head and kept typing. That evening, Trey showed up again, this time with a thick envelope and a grim expression. "She fined Yvette," he said. $300. Said her mailbox was 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. Hannah's fingers paused on the keyboard. "Did Yvette measure it?" "She did," Trey replied. "It was within code. But Karen sent contractors anyway. They pulled the whole damn thing out while Yvette begged them not to." He handed over a USB drive. I recorded it. We watched the footage together. It was grainy, shaky, filmed from a front window across the street, but it was all there. Yvette, elderly and leaning on her cane, trying to plead with the workers. One of them laughing as he yanked the post out of the concrete. Hannah leaned in slightly, the corners of her mouth tightening. She didn't curse. She didn't shout. She simply hit pause and asked, "Has this kind of thing been happening a lot?" Trey nodded. "At least a dozen families. Nobody wants to speak up. Karen hits hard and fast. Legal threats. Random fees. Public shaming at meetings." Hannah opened a fresh document and titled it Incident Timeline. Yvette's name was the first entry. That night, the neighborhood was strangely quiet. The porch lights flickered on earlier than usual, blinds pulled down with a touch too much urgency. We heard whispers outside, the occasional shuffle of someone walking past but not stopping. There was a tension, like the air itself knew something was shifting. Hannah didn't say much. She compiled documents, annotated printouts, and began cross-referencing Karen's flyers with county code. She discovered something then, something neither of us had expected. Our home, along with several others on the same block, had been annexed into the HOA boundary less than a year ago. But the annexation paperwork was flimsy. There was no record of consent from the previous owners, no community vote, no formal notification filed with the city clerk. Hannah looked up, her eyes sharp. "If this holds, they have no legal authority over our property," she said. "Not just us. Everyone annexed under that vote might be exempt. Which means every fine, every warning, every violation, null and void." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about a woman on crutches anymore. This was structural fraud, a fraudulent expansion of jurisdiction, used to impose illegal fines on residents too intimidated to fight back. Karen wasn't just cruel. She was running a scam wrapped in suburban legitimacy. The next morning, another notice arrived. This time, it was about our porch paint. "Non-compliant hue," it said, with a photo of our gray-blue railing circled in red. A $150 fine was attached. We hadn't even painted it, the previous owners had. Hannah placed the notice into her folder without comment. Then she did something new. She sent an anonymous tip to the district attorney's office. Not as a judge, as a concerned citizen with attachments. The file included photo evidence, dated notices, the video of Yvette, and excerpts of the HOA charter that Karen had allegedly altered without a community vote. That afternoon, Karen escalated again. She showed up with a measuring tape and clipboard, marched straight onto our lawn without knocking, and began measuring our porch step. I stepped outside and told her to leave. She smirked and said HOA officers were permitted to inspect structures at will. I replied that trespassing laws still existed. She called me hostile, snapped one last photo, and strutted away. Hannah didn't move. She didn't confront her. She just opened another browser tab and started researching state-level protections for private property. Within the hour, she confirmed our suspicion. Annexation without voluntary agreement was not legally enforceable. A precedent from a 2009 case in our own district supported the claim. If we filed correctly, not only could we get the HOA's grip off our property, we could help dozens of neighbors do the same. That night, Hannah hosted a quiet meeting. Just Trey, Yvette, and one other neighbor, a single mom named Clara who'd been fined repeatedly for leaving her kids' bike outside. Clara arrived with a folder of her own. She'd kept every notice, every letter, every email. Hannah laid out her findings. She spoke slowly, methodically, never raising her voice. By the end, Trey leaned back and said, "Well, I'll be damned." Clara was crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears of someone who had lived too long thinking they were alone. For the first time, they weren't. The next morning, Karen returned, this time with 2 board members and a laminated binder. She handed Hannah an official final notice of correction, demanding the ramp be removed, the porch repainted, and all HOA correspondence be responded to within 5 business days or face escalating compliance actions. Hannah smiled politely. "Thank you," she said. "We'll be responding through legal channels." Karen blinked. "Legal channels?" Hannah nodded. "As per HOA Charter Clause 37, subsection C, and State Compliance Statute Section 9. Karen frowned, said something about calling a lawyer, and stormed off. Hannah didn't flinch. She opened her laptop, clicked on a spreadsheet titled Structural Violations, and added another row. The folder on the shelf had doubled in size. She was no longer documenting a conflict. She was building a case. Line by line, statute by statute, witness by witness. She wasn't angry. She was ready. And somewhere deep inside, Karen must have felt it too, that something was coming, bigger than her binders, stronger than her fines. Something inevitable, relentless, quiet, like a gavel just before it falls. By the following Monday, something had changed, not in the air, not in the way the birds sang or the light bent over the sidewalks, but in the way people looked at us when they passed. Not with the hostile, HOA-trained suspicion we had grown used to, but with something quieter, more uncertain. Curiosity. A few even nodded. One man walking his dog gave a subtle thumbs up without stopping. It was as if they had heard whispers but weren't yet sure whether they were true, or whether acknowledging them might earn them a violation notice too. Hannah had not slowed down. If anything, she had become even more focused. She spent most mornings on the porch, laptop balanced on her knees, reviewing municipal case law and drafting formal complaints. The manila folders inside our living room cabinet had multiplied, now labeled not just HOA violations but property line irregularities, annexation legality, and resident statements. She had turned our small home into a war room, and the walls seemed to pulse with quiet purpose. That afternoon, Trey dropped off something unexpected. A copy of the HOA's financial statements from the past 2 years, which he had obtained through a contact who had once served on the board before Karen pushed them out. The pages were dense with line items, figures, and project names that sounded vague enough to mean nothing and specific enough to hide everything. But one detail stood out. A $75,000 landscaping expense paid to a company called Silver Fern Group. Hannah ran a search. The business had no website, no real digital footprint beyond a P.O. box and a disconnected phone number. Within 10 minutes, she found the name of the owner, Carson Maddox. A quick background check revealed that he was Karen's cousin. Classic shell game, Hannah muttered, highlighting the name. Ghost vendor, inflated contracts, community funds disappearing into a void. She dug deeper. There was another charge, $40,000 labeled legal consultation services, with no accompanying case number or explanation. No firm name. No point of contact. Just money drained monthly in steady increments. It was embezzlement disguised in bureaucracy. The kind of scam that only worked when everyone else was too tired or too afraid to look closely. Hannah wasn't either. That evening, she sent an encrypted file to the state auditor's office under an alias. Just data. No accusations. No grand statements. Only numbers, patterns, and proof. Karen must have sensed the ground shifting, even if she didn't know why. The next day, she launched what could only be described as a suburban smear campaign. Freshly printed flyers appeared on doors and mailboxes titled, "Restoring Community Harmony." It was 4 pages of vague warnings, buzzwords about neighborhood safety, and unsubtle jabs at outside agitators and individuals misrepresenting their roles. There was no name mentioned, but the subtext practically screamed judge with a grudge. One section encouraged residents to document suspicious activity and report non-compliant behavior to HOA enforcement. Another paragraph invited volunteers to join a newly proposed Neighborhood Watch subcommittee, complete with a call to monitor problematic homes for escalating behaviors. Hannah read the flyer once, wordlessly, then filed it into a folder titled Intimidation. Attempts. She had stopped reacting. She had become the storm's eye, still, focused, and dangerous. That same afternoon, Clara, the single mom who had quietly joined the meeting on our porch days earlier, knocked on our door, clutching a manila envelope. Her face was pale, jaw tight. "I think I'm being followed," she said, stepping inside. "There was a car parked across from my driveway all morning. Same one from yesterday." Hannah listened calmly as Clara explained how she'd received her 3rd warning in a week, this time for excessive lawn toys in the side yard, even though her son had only left out 1 plastic truck. "They said if I don't respond in 3 days, I could face a lien," Clara added. "Can they do that?" "Not legally," Hannah replied. "Not without arbitration, and certainly not for a child's toy." She opened her laptop and added Clara's experience to the growing timeline. "Did you get photos of the car?" Clara nodded. "Front and back." Hannah didn't even blink. She took the flash drive, uploaded the images, and cross-referenced the license plate using a legal database she still had access to as a judge. The car was registered to a contractor who'd previously worked under the HOA's maintenance fund. Another thread. Another connection. Another stitch in the unraveling tapestry of Karen's reign. By Thursday, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates rolled through the neighborhood. It stopped briefly in front of Karen's house, still the unofficial headquarters of her HOA dominion. 2 men in suits exited, took photographs, and spoke to someone inside. It wasn't clear which agency they belonged to. There were no visible logos. But by the time they left, the neighborhood had erupted in whispers. Karen must have noticed. Her posture the next morning was different. She didn't strut. She paced. Her clipboard no longer felt like a weapon. It looked like a shield. She stopped at random houses, handed out flyers that no one seemed to want, and offered statements that came off more like apologies than mandates. That night, Trey came over again, this time with news he could barely contain. A former board member Karen had forced out months ago had come forward and contacted a local investigative journalist. He had emails, financial records, and a recorded conversation in which Karen openly discussed bypassing vote protocols to push through HOA projects. The journalist was planning to publish the story in a regional outlet by the following weekend. Hannah thanked him and filed the update away like a seasoned intelligence officer. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. "This isn't about punishment," she said. "It's about exposure. Letting the rot see the light." Then she returned to her laptop and began preparing an anonymous briefing for the State Judicial Review Board, not just for her protection, but to preserve the integrity of the case once it became public. The final confirmation came in an email the next morning. The District Attorney's Special Investigations Unit had opened a preliminary inquiry into possible financial misconduct within the HOA. The subject line was clinical, detached. The kind of cold efficiency that meant something very real was now in motion. Hannah read it, sipped her coffee, and simply said, "It's beginning." Across the street, Karen stared from her window. She must have known something was coming. She just didn't know how far it had already gone. The ground under her feet was no longer stable. And the woman she had tried to crush with a wedge sandal wasn't angry. She wasn't loud. She was simply prepared. Waiting. Watching. Letting the system she believed in do what it was meant to do. Hold power accountable. even in the quiet corners of suburban America, where corruption wore pastel colors and smelled like lemon-scented HOA newsletters. Friday evening arrived with the kind of heavy stillness that usually precedes a storm. The community clubhouse, normally used for yoga classes and toddler birthday parties, had been transformed into a stage for Karen's last attempt at control. The folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows, each seat marked with a printed agenda that reeked of false professionalism. On the dais at the front, a plastic table had been covered with a cheap navy cloth and set with a gavel Karen had no legal authority to wield. She stood behind it in a cream blazer, trying too hard to look composed. Her lips were pursed, her hands clenched slightly at her sides. People trickled in slowly, some hesitant, some curious, most visibly skeptical. It wasn't the turnout Karen had expected, it was bigger. Word had spread, not just about the hearing but about Hannah. About the judge living in the corner house with the ramp and the calm, unshakable eyes. The air buzzed with quiet tension as neighbors filled the room, clutching HOA newsletters that had morphed from community updates into bizarre propaganda pamphlets. A few carried folders, some whispered to each other, others just stared ahead, waiting. Hannah and I walked in together. She wore a plain blouse, slate gray slacks, and a simple silver bracelet I'd given her years ago. No robe. No badge. Just quiet confidence. Karen's eyes tracked her from the moment we stepped through the door, but she didn't greet us. She cleared her throat into the microphone, the static cutting briefly through the silence. Thank you all for coming. This is a disciplinary hearing to address repeated noncompliance and community disruption by recent residents. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. We are here to restore order and maintain the values that make our neighborhood strong. Hannah sat calmly in the second row, flipping through a neatly bound document. When Karen called us forward to speak, Hannah rose without a pause, thanked the board for the opportunity, and walked to the front with the kind of deliberate grace that made every movement seem intentional. She placed her document on the table. According to the HOA charter, she began, Clause 17 requires 10 days notice for disciplinary proceedings and mandates a neutral third-party review. May I ask who the neutral party is? Karen blinked. The board, she answered too quickly. We are empowered to. The board is not neutral, Hannah interrupted gently, her tone unwavering. It is comprised of elected residents with a stake in the outcome. She flipped to another page. This hearing violates your own bylaws. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Karen's jaw twitched. Hannah turned toward the audience. I understand many of you were told this hearing was about our ramp, our paint, or our porch furniture. That it was about behavior or noncompliance. It's not. She handed out copies of her report, which included photos, invoices, and financial discrepancies tied directly to Karen's leadership. This is about transparency. About funds paid to companies with no operating record, about services billed but never delivered, about rules enforced inconsistently, often against the most vulnerable residents. She paused, letting her words settle. And it's about a pattern of abuse disguised as neighborhood management. There was silence for a moment, then someone in the back stood and began clapping. One clap. Two. Then a few more joined in, hesitant but building. Karen slammed the gavel against the table. Order, she shouted. This is slander. She's manipulating you. Hannah didn't flinch. She looked Karen in the eye and said, Your HOA charter does not give you immunity from oversight. Your position is not a shield from accountability. She then revealed a page showing the company Silver Fern Group's ownership trail leading back to Karen's cousin. Community funds, over $75,000, transferred to a company with no address, no website, and no visible operations. That's embezzlement. Karen's face paled. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lawyer, a man who looked more suited for insurance paperwork than public hearings, stood abruptly and whispered something in her ear. She shoved his hand away. Another resident stepped forward. Yvette, walking with her cane, holding a flash drive. I have videos too, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Of them tearing out my mailbox while I begged them not to. They laughed. I want people to see it. Trey came next, carrying a stack of printed emails and board minutes that had been edited post-distribution. These are different than what I received originally, he said. Someone's been doctoring the records. Then Clara approached with a USB drive containing a recording of Karen making threats over the phone, telling her that if she continued associating with disruptive elements, her dues would be reconsidered. The room was no longer neutral. It had shifted, unmistakably. What began as a tribunal meant to shame us had become a collective unmasking. Karen was losing control not because of shouting or protest, but because the facts were louder than her voice. She reached for the mic again, but her hand shook. This is all taken out of context. You're trying to destroy me. Hannah tilted her head. You did that yourself. Karen stumbled back a step. Her lawyer whispered again, more forcefully this time. She ignored him. The residents didn't leave. No one stormed out. No one yelled. Instead, they walked up to Hannah, one by one, and started sharing. Stories. Documents. Photos of violations. Scans of letters. Screenshots of texts. A woman in the front row gave her a folder she'd hidden for months, containing evidence of Karen's pressure tactics during a proxy vote. A man from the cul-de-sac whispered about an HOA-sponsored vendor threatening to report undocumented labor unless paid in cash. The truth poured out in quiet waves. We left that clubhouse not in silence, but surrounded by a hum of conversation, of unity that hadn't existed before. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stood together. Karen remained behind, still at her little podium, shell-shocked, unmoving. The next morning, the fallout began. The local news picked up the story, thanks to the investigative journalist who had already begun drafting the article. The headline read, "Suburban HOA accused of financial abuse and discrimination." Karen's photo, taken mid-scream during the hearing, was shared across social media. Some commenters were sympathetic. Most weren't. That same day, a notice appeared in our mailbox, not from the HOA, but from the State Attorney General's office. They had formally opened a full investigation into the HOA's financial practices and code enforcement history. Hannah received confirmation that her documentation had been accepted. She was now a key witness. Not a judge in the legal sense, but a catalyst. That weekend, no one saw Karen. Her blinds remained closed. Her car didn't move. But the neighborhood did. Trey met with other residents and organized an emergency HOA vote to dissolve the current board and implement third-party oversight. Flyers went out. Volunteers signed up. For the first time in years, people smiled at each other again. They waved. Kids played on sidewalks without fear of receiving a citation for unsightly activity. A line had been crossed, and a new one had been drawn. Karen thought the hearing would be her victory lap. Instead, it was the first domino in a chain reaction she couldn't control. And Hannah, quiet, methodical, and relentless, never once raised her voice. She didn't have to. The facts spoke loud enough. 2 weeks after the hearing, the final judgment was issued in a courthouse packed with tension and people who had once only peeked through their blinds. The case had escalated beyond neighborhood politics. Now it involved regional news, legal oversight, and a community that had finally found its voice. The hearing wasn't about Hannah. She had made that clear early on. Despite being a judge, she had recused herself from presiding over the lawsuit filed by the residents against the HOA due to her personal stake in the matter. A fellow judge from a neighboring district, neutral and precise, was assigned to oversee the final ruling. But Hannah was there that morning, not as the plaintiff, not as a symbol, but as a citizen among many, standing at the back of the room in plain clothes, her hands folded calmly as she listened to the closing statements. Karen entered with none of the bluster she had once carried like perfume. Her hair was pinned back too tightly, her face drawn and paler than anyone had seen it before. Her lawyer walked ahead of her now, no longer the deferential shadow but a buffer. The courtroom was silent as the judge began to read. The charges were laid out like dominoes: unauthorized financial transactions, violations of ADA codes, abuse of authority, embezzlement through shell entities, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Each count was backed by documentation, testimony, and cross-examination from weeks of proceedings that had dismantled the illusion Karen had spent years building. Restitution was ordered, to the residents fined illegally, to the individuals harassed or targeted under false pretenses, and to the local government for falsified filings. Karen's personal assets were to be frozen pending a full audit of the HOA accounts. She was barred from holding any leadership position in any registered HOA within the state. A federal review of ADA-related violations was also recommended, opening the door for additional civil rights litigation. Karen didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply sat, still as stone, as the weight of her actions was laid bare in legal language too specific to dismiss. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but reporters waited outside. When the doors opened, questions flew like arrows. Hannah didn't answer any. She merely thanked the court for its diligence and the residents for their courage. Her statement was short, clear. Justice was not revenge. It was a return to balance. That evening, a town hall was held, not in secrecy, not at Karen's garage-converted office, but in the newly cleared Liberty Grove Commons. The name change, once symbolic, had now been legally adopted by the community. The emergency board elections were underway, and Trey, encouraged by a groundswell of support, was officially voted in as interim president. One of his first actions was to motion for a 5-year audit of HOA finances to ensure transparency going forward. The vote passed unanimously. Fines were suspended, violations were reviewed, and a new appeals process was created with third-party oversight. What had once been a climate of fear had shifted into one of reluctant optimism. Karen's house, once the gravitational center of silent intimidation, was quiet. Within days, a for sale sign appeared on the lawn. Moving trucks arrived one morning, just after sunrise. A few neighbors watched from their porches but said nothing. No one approached her. No one shouted. She left without goodbyes. No ceremony. Just the quiet unpacking of a reign built on fear and paperwork. Her presence, once so constant, had become an absence that breathed relief. In the weeks that followed, Hannah returned to the garden she had barely touched since we arrived. She planted basil and tomatoes, carefully restoring the sense of peace she had long sought before Karen's wedge heel ever struck her crutches. The ramp that had once been cited as a structural blight was now lined with flower pots donated by neighbors. A small plaque, gifted anonymously, had been placed at the bottom step. It read, "For every unjust rule, there is a woman brave enough to rewrite it." Children rode their bikes more freely. Mailboxes were repainted, not because of citation threats, but because someone volunteered to help. Porch swings were fixed. Windows opened again. The silence that had once choked the community became something else entirely, space to breathe. Clara no longer hid her son's toys. Yvette received a new, ADA-compliant mailbox paid for by a small fundraising pot started by 2 teenagers. Trey organized monthly meetings with open forums, where no question was dismissed and every vote was recorded transparently. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time, people participated not out of fear, but because they wanted to. One evening, as we sat on the porch, Hannah turned to me and said, "It's strange how quickly people forget who once scared them." I asked if that bothered her. She shook her head. "No," she said, "because forgetting fear is the first step toward living freely. Let them forget her face. But not what they learned." She kept everything, the documents, the files, the printed violations. Not out of spite, but as evidence. Not as a weapon, but as a record. A reminder that even small power, when abused, demands accountability. A month after the final ruling, the journalist who had first picked up the story published a long-form piece. It featured interviews with residents, legal analysis, and even a quote from the presiding judge who had delivered the final decision. The headline read, "From Crutches to Courtroom, How One Neighborhood Fought Back Against Silent Tyranny." Hannah never read the article aloud, but I saw her smile quietly when she finished. There was no celebration, no parade, but there was laughter, real, shared, and unafraid. And in a place once ruled by clipboards and suspicion, that alone felt revolutionary. Karen became a cautionary tale told over fences and at book clubs, not out of malice, but as a shared reminder of what complacency could allow. Her name was no longer feared, it was context. Her legacy not power, but a warning. One afternoon, as kids rode past our house on scooters and neighbors gathered near the garden beds to plan a community cookout, I looked at Hannah. She stood with sunlight falling across her shoulders, her hands covered in soil, her face soft and at peace. She didn't need anyone to thank her. She had never done it for recognition. She did it because she could. Because someone had to. Because when a woman kicks another's crutches, she doesn't just challenge her balance, she tests her foundation. And Hannah's was unshakable. What began as a cruel moment at a picnic became a spark. That spark became a fire. And that fire lit the way for truth to burn through a system built on fear. No vengeance. No spectacle. Just one woman standing, not because she wanted to fight, but because she refused to fall.